Australia is shrugging off an unprecedented breakdown in talks between the Asia-Pacific's greatest powers that's ended this year's APEC summit in stalemate. The inability of the US and China to agree on trade has raised questions about what's been achieved at the Papua New Guinea meeting, which was heavily backed by Canberra. The Prime Minister concedes there are big differences to bridge between the rivals, but suggests there can be compromise at the next summit. Pacific Affairs reporter Stephen Jedgetts has been covering the talks in Port Moresby.
From just off the coast, Australian troops keep watch on Port Moresby's APEC weekend. A role of Pacific protector, Scott Morrison wants the ADF to do a lot more of.
This is where we step up. This is where I ask all of you to step up.
Aboard the biggest ship in the Navy's fleet,
They do a great job serving us.
the Prime Minister sees a platform for a near constant presence in the region.
Kakadu, this is PM, cleared the land 5 spot.
But as the APEC summit proved, those vying for influence in the Pacific aren't given to taking instructions.
It's not about control, it's about collaboration and it's about partnership.
China and the US left Port Moresby totally at odds. Trade was the breaking point. Host Peter O'Neill was left to explain an unprecedented and embarrassing deadlock.
We have almost 21 economists agreeing to all the issues that we have discussed, and it is not frustration.
There'd be no written statement from his summit.
We've got to stop kidding ourselves that everyone's going to agree all the time.
The impasse frustrated middle powers, including Australia, Indonesia and Vietnam, who tried but failed to hammer out a compromise between the two powers.
The fact that they disagree on a number of things, that'll be picked up at the G20.
I don't think that we can live in a world of denial and pretend that APEC was a success when it wasn't.
Providing security for APEC was a massive and expensive logistical exercise, and Australian taxpayers spent more than $200 million to ensure that the summit got off the ground. The Australian government is relieved that logistically everything went smoothly, but disappointed that politically it ended in acrimony.
How are you? Yeah, good, thanks.
Even so, Scott Morrison leaves PNG knowing Australia's secured what's likely to be a large and enduring presence here, backed by the might of the US military for the development of a naval base on Manus Island.
We have to sort of manage our interests against what is now going to be heightened competition between Washington and Beijing.
The competitive stakes just got higher at this summit.
And Stephen Jedgetts joins us from Port Moresby. Stephen, the sharp words between China and the US has raised fears of another Cold War. Is that a possibility?
Well, Matt, competition is certainly intensifying between the two great powers. That said, there are some big differences between the Cold War and the present day. After all, during the Cold War, there was a constant and fairly high risk for catastrophic military conflict breaking out. That risk today doesn't exist. It's much lower. Nonetheless, there are some echoes and similarities here to the Cold War. After all, just as happened between the US and the Soviet Union, the US and China are currently engaged in a bidding war, trying to use infrastructure, aid, grants and other mechanisms to try and gain influence in smaller nations. And then, of course, on top of that, there's the economic question as well. The US and China are caught in a fierce trade war right now, and there is a real risk that it could escalate dramatically. And if that does happen, then Australia faces some really, really serious dangers.
And so what are the chances of China and the US actually resolving this?
It's almost impossible to say with any certainty at this point. President Donald Trump will meet Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, at the G20 meeting in Argentina at the end of this month. Now, the stakes have been raised dramatically for that meeting in the wake of the breakdown of negotiations here in Port Moresby. Some observers have been hoping that the two men may be able to strike some sort of grand bargain on trade and avert a full-blown trade conflict. But the US Vice President Mike Pence has made it very clear here in Papua New Guinea that the US is in no mood to compromise.
All right, Stephen Jedgetts, thanks for your time.